They say there's a certain silence that falls in a kitchen when betrayal walks in wearing the shoes of someone you raised. A silence so heavy you can feel the steam from the teapot stop midair. I remember that silence as clearly as I remember her voice, steady but pitched for the audience she'd summoned. "My mother stole my bracelet," Elise told the police, right there in my kitchen, her hand resting lightly on the countertop as if she were discussing the weather. It was a pearl and diamond piece, nothing I had ever laid eyes on before this visit, but her tone made it sound like she was describing an inevitable truth about me, something everyone in the room should have already suspected. There was no tremor in her voice, no hesitation, just the kind of calm you use when you believe the room belongs to you. I stood by the sink, the teapot still warm beneath my palm, and watched two uniformed officers step over the threshold, polite in that careful way that says they already believe the person who called them. My kitchen smelled of cinnamon and bergamot, the lingering trace of the tea I had made for her that morning. The tea she hadn't touched, because she said she was cutting back on caffeine, a claim I knew was more about having one more thing to control. At 78, I thought I'd heard every kind of unkindness from my family, but this was new. This wasn't forgetting to call on my birthday, or leaving me off a holiday invitation, or pretending they'd just misplaced the family photographs that showed me in my younger years. This was stepping into my home, eating the scones I baked from scratch, sleeping in the guest room I prepared with clean sheets and fresh towels, and then calling the police to accuse me of theft. When you are my age, you carry your dignity the way you carry your bones, quietly, carefully, knowing that once it breaks, it will never heal quite the same. So I didn't shout. I didn't demand. I didn't even use her name. I asked the officers if they would like to see my jewelry box, the one my late husband gave me on our 25th anniversary, the one filled with small, modest pieces that meant more for their stories than their value. They nodded and I led them to my bedroom, my steps steady but slow, not from weakness, but because I refused to rush for anyone who had come here to suspect me. As they examined my things, I thought about Elise's face at breakfast that morning, the way she had looked at me when she thought I wasn't paying attention, flat, assessing, almost cold. I thought about how she had called me last month asking to visit, her voice unusually warm, telling me she wanted some quiet time together. I thought about how she had insisted on bringing a small hard-shell suitcase into the guest room instead of leaving it in the hallway like she usually did, how she had kept her purse close, never leaving it in the living room or kitchen when she stepped out. At the time, I chalked it up to habit, maybe even a little paranoia from living in a big city. Now, I could see the shape of the things she'd been carrying inside her, this accusation, this performance, and I realized it had been with her long before she arrived. I should tell you who I am before you think I'm just a character in someone else's cautionary tale. I am a woman who once balanced 2 jobs, 3 children, and a crumbling marriage without letting the roof cave in. I have lived in this small coastal town for nearly 3 decades, in a house that creaks like an old friend and smells of wood polish and sea air. I grow rosemary in a chipped clay pot by the kitchen window. I mend my clothes when they tear. I walk to the market every Thursday for fresh bread. I am not rich, but I am not poor, because I have always understood the value of $1 and the cost of self-respect. My neighbors know me as the woman who bakes for the church bazaar, who shovels her own walkway in winter, who remembers the birthdays of their children even when those children have long since moved away. And yes, I am Elise's mother, though I do not know when that relationship began to feel more like an unpaid debt collector's account than a bond between 2 people who once held each other without hesitation. When the officers finished their search and found nothing, of course they found nothing, I offered them tea. They declined as I expected, but one of them gave me a look, a flicker of something human in his eyes that said he understood more than he could put in his report. Elise stood by the doorway, her arms folded, her mouth a tight line. She didn't look at me. She didn't thank the officers. She just followed them out onto the porch, speaking in a low voice I couldn't catch. I stood at the kitchen table, my hands resting flat on the wood, and felt the echo of their boots fade down the walkway. Outside, gulls were calling over the water. Inside, the tea had gone cold. It is a strange thing to realize in the middle of an ordinary morning that someone you once carried inside your own body now sees you as disposable, or worse, as dangerous. I wanted to tell myself there must be some misunderstanding, that perhaps she had lost the bracelet somewhere and convinced herself I had taken it out of absent-mindedness, that she was embarrassed and panicked and had made a terrible mistake. But I know Elise. I know the deliberate way she frames a story, the way she shapes herself into the victim before anyone else can speak. I know she has always cared more about appearances than about truth, that in her world, control is the highest currency. And yet, even knowing this, a part of me still wanted to believe she was capable of regret. I stayed standing for a long time after the door closed. The light had shifted, the sun sliding higher over the bay, the shadows in the room changing shape. I could hear the slow tick of the clock on the wall, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the whisper of wind through the rosemary by the window. I thought about the first bracelet I ever owned, a simple silver chain my mother gave me when I was 16, telling me that a woman should have something beautiful that belonged only to her. I thought about how I had kept that bracelet through decades of moves and losses, through the lean years when even beauty had to earn its keep. And I thought about how, in all those years, I had never once accused someone I loved of stealing it. That was the moment I understood that this wasn't about jewelry at all. This was about erasing me, about writing me out of my own story, about leaving behind an image of me that could be shaped into whatever served her best. I wish I could say I felt nothing, that I let the accusation roll off me like rain off a roof. But that would be a lie. It hurt in a place deeper than the ribs, deeper than the spine, in that tender part of the soul where you keep the belief that blood means loyalty. It hurt because I had built my life on the idea that my children would carry some part of me forward with kindness, and now I saw how easily that part could be dropped. And yet, beneath the hurt, something else stirred, a quiet, stubborn pulse of resolve. I didn't know yet how, but I knew I would not let this moment define the rest of my days. The tea was cold, yes, but I was still warm enough to hold my ground, warm enough to wait for the right moment to speak my truth, warm enough to see, even through the haze of betrayal, that there are some fires you tend for yourself alone. The day Elise made that phone call to the police, claiming that I had stolen her diamond bracelet, felt like a sharp crack in the fragile glass of my life, a crack that threatened to shatter everything I thought I had built over the years. It began as a quiet morning, with the usual sounds of the coastal town filtering through the slightly open window, the distant call of a fishing boat, the soft rustle of wind through the pine trees, and the faint murmur of neighbors tending to their gardens. Elise arrived early, as she often did, bearing the carefully controlled air of someone who holds grudges as tightly as treasured possessions. She moved through my home with a practiced ease, inspecting rooms I had cleaned and prepared, making offhand remarks about dust or clutter, her voice never rising above a polite, measured tone. At breakfast, she nibbled on the scones I baked, but her eyes were elsewhere, fixed on the gleaming silverware or the chipped china that, to her, must have seemed relics of a past she was eager to distance herself from. Our conversation was stilted, punctuated by polite questions about the weather or the town's slow changes, but beneath it lay a tension I could feel in my bones, a sense that she was here not to reconnect, but to assert control. The morning passed in this uneasy silence, and I found myself watching her from the kitchen doorway as she packed a small purse with an intensity that felt almost ritualistic. She pulled the bracelet from a velvet pouch and fastened it tightly around her wrist, then turned to me with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "I'm going to run some errands," she said, her voice smooth, but carrying an edge I had learned to recognize as prelude to confrontation. "I'll be back before lunch." I nodded, trying to mask the knot forming in my stomach. The hours she was gone stretched long and heavy, each minute ticking with the weight of unspoken fears. When the doorbell finally rang, it was not Elise who stood outside, but two police officers, their expressions formal but tinged with sympathy, as if they were delivering bad news rather than seeking a criminal. They explained that Elise had called to report a theft, that her diamond bracelet had disappeared during her visit, and she suspected I was responsible. I was stunned into silence, unable to find words for the swirling storm of disbelief, betrayal, and shame that overwhelmed me. The officers asked me to cooperate, to allow them to search my home, and I agreed, knowing resistance would only feed their suspicions. I felt like a ghost in my own house as they methodically inspected every drawer and cabinet, lifting velvet-lined boxes and rifling through jewelry collections with clinical precision. Their presence was a quiet invasion, the subtle erosion of my sanctuary, and I realized then how fragile the bonds of family trust had become. Elise watched from the living room, arms crossed, silent and unreadable, as if this spectacle was a performance meant for an audience I was excluded from. I caught her gaze briefly. No apology, no hesitation, only a cold resolve that cut deeper than any words could. As the search concluded with no evidence found, the officers prepared to leave, but I could see the doubt lingering in their eyes, a hesitation born of the complexity of family disputes that often defy simple answers. One of them handed me a card with contact information and advised me to consider seeking legal counsel if needed. Elise refused to speak, slipping past the officers and out the door, leaving me standing in a house suddenly too large and too empty. The silence that followed was deafening. I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, the air thick with the smell of brewed coffee and old wood, trying to steady my trembling hands. How had it come to this? When had the love I thought we shared turned to suspicion and betrayal? I remembered the years of sacrifices, the late nights spent nursing fevers, the lunches packed for school trips, the holidays spent sewing costumes and baking cakes. Had it all been nothing but a prelude to this final humiliating act? In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the house was charged with a strange tension. Elise avoided me, retreating to the guest room with her purse clutched tightly to her chest, as if it contained more than just her belongings. I found myself watching her from doorways and corners, searching for signs of the daughter I once knew beneath the layers of anger and fear she now wore like armor. Friends and neighbors who had always known me as a kind and patient woman began to look away when we crossed paths, unsure whether to offer condolences or judgment. The local grocery store clerk, who had greeted me warmly for years, now glanced over his shoulder before speaking, as if wary of being drawn into a family drama. I felt increasingly invisible and isolated, as if the accusation had not only stained my reputation, but severed my connection to the community that had been my lifeline. Throughout this ordeal, I grappled with my own doubts and fears. Was it possible that I had somehow forgotten the bracelet, misplaced it in a moment of confusion? Was my memory faltering, as some whispered about the elderly? The loneliness of those questions was a heavy burden, but even heavier was the quiet fury that simmered beneath. This was not a case of forgetfulness or misunderstanding. This was a deliberate act of betrayal, a fracture in a relationship that had been fragile for too long. I began to sift through memories, recalling moments when Elise's words had cut deeper than necessary, when her actions had left me feeling diminished and unseen. I saw patterns of control disguised as care, of affection twisted into obligation. This accusation was the culmination of years of unspoken resentment and unhealed wounds. One afternoon, as I sat in my favorite armchair by the window, watching the sunlight dance across the garden, I resolved not to let this betrayal define me. I would find the truth no matter how painful, and reclaim my dignity from the shadows Elise sought to cast over me. I began to think carefully about every detail of her visit, the moments that felt odd or rehearsed, the way she had handled her belongings, the brief pauses in conversation where something unsaid hung thick in the air. It was then that I remembered the day we had gone to the antique market together, 2 days before the police arrived. Elise had been excited, almost giddy, as she spotted a delicate bracelet at one of the stalls. I had watched her bargain with the seller, admired the way the sunlight caught the stones as she tried it on. I recalled how she had slipped the receipt into her purse without a word, her eyes bright with satisfaction. That receipt, I knew, was the key to unlocking the truth. With a quiet determination, I waited until Elise left the guest room unattended for a moment. I approached the purse she had left hanging on the back of the door, my hands steady despite the pounding of my heart. Inside, tucked between the pages of a novel she had brought, was the receipt, crisp and clean, dated just days before her arrival, the proof I needed, yet also a painful reminder of the trust that had been shattered. I held it gently, as if it were a fragile thing, knowing that this simple slip of paper held the power to change everything. When the officers returned to follow up, I presented it to them without a word. Elise's face, when she saw it, was a mixture of shock and something else. Fear, perhaps, or regret, masked by anger. She stammered, tried to dismiss it as irrelevant, but the officers took it seriously, their expressions unreadable as they led her aside for further questioning. That day marked a turning point. I felt a quiet surge of relief, tempered by the sorrow of what had been lost. I knew there would be no easy reconciliation, no quick healing of wounds so deep. But I also knew that I had reclaimed something precious, my truth. I had faced the accusation not with bitterness, but with the calm certainty of a woman who understands that dignity cannot be stolen, only surrendered. As I watched Elise leave my home that evening, I realized that this chapter was closing, not with anger or recrimination, but with the quiet strength of a woman who would no longer be invisible, who would no longer be silenced. The days ahead would be difficult, the path uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, I felt the stirrings of hope, not for forgiveness, but for freedom. The days following the police's departure from my home were heavy with a weight I had not anticipated, a lingering presence that seemed to settle in every corner, turning familiar spaces into foreign landscapes. I found myself waking in the early morning hours, the quiet of the house amplifying every creak of the floorboards and whisper of the wind outside my bedroom window. My thoughts raced with questions I dared not speak aloud, doubts gnawing at the edges of my resolve, threatening to unravel the fragile thread of dignity I clung to. The receipt I had found in Elise's purse, the irrefutable proof that she had lied, was both a shield and a reminder of how deeply fractured our relationship had become. Yet even with this evidence in hand, the emotional erosion continued, subtle and relentless. Elise did not return to the house after the questioning by the officers, and with each passing hour, the silence left in her wake seemed less like peace and more like abandonment. The guest room she had occupied, once a temporary refuge for a daughter I wished to embrace, now felt like a cold monument to the distance growing between us. I began to notice the small ways that the accusation had changed the rhythm of my days, the cautious glances of neighbors when I ventured outside, the polite but distant smiles at the grocery store, the way my phone sat silent on the kitchen counter, its screen dark and uninviting. Even my closest friends tread lightly around me, unsure whether to offer comfort or to stay away. In this quiet isolation, I was left to confront not only the betrayal, but the creeping fear that this fracture might never heal. My body, too, seemed to echo the unease that filled my mind. The familiar aches in my knees and shoulders felt sharper, my sleep more restless. I caught myself hesitating before answering the door, my hands trembling slightly as I reached for the knob. The house, which had once been a sanctuary filled with the warmth of years and memories, now felt like a stage set for a drama I had no control over. The kitchen table bore the marks of hurried meals and unshared conversations. The teapot stood untouched for hours, cold as the distance growing between me and my daughter. The nights stretched endlessly, each one punctuated by dreams I tried to forget, visions of accusations whispered behind closed doors, the soft clink of the missing bracelet falling through empty air, and my own reflection in a mirror that seemed to distort rather than reveal. In the midst of this growing unease, I found a strange comfort in routine, clinging to the small rituals that reminded me I was still present, still capable. I tended to my rosemary plant by the kitchen window, pruning its brittle branches with gentle care. I baked scones and lemon cakes, placing them carefully in tins to share with neighbors and friends, even though the thought of sharing felt bittersweet. I walked the familiar paths along the coast, feeling the sharp salt air fill my lungs, trying to breathe away the heaviness that clung to my chest. But no matter how much I moved or baked or pruned, the silence in the house remained, a constant reminder that something had shifted irrevocably. One afternoon, as I sat by the window sipping tea, I noticed a small envelope tucked beneath the welcome mat outside my front door. It was unmarked, worn at the edges, and when I opened it, I found a note from a neighbor, an elderly woman who had always been kind but reserved, offering help if I ever needed it. Her words were simple but kind. We all have storms to weather, and sometimes the fiercest winds blow from within our own homes. I folded the note carefully and placed it in my jewelry box, a quiet acknowledgement that even in my isolation, I was not entirely alone. Yet the note also underscored the truth I was beginning to accept. The storm was far from over, and the fiercest winds were indeed coming from the family I had loved and trusted. The days blurred together, each one marked by a subtle escalation of the emotional distance between Elise and me. Phone calls went unanswered, messages remained unread, and the silence between us grew like a wall, thick and impenetrable. I received a few texts from her, short and clipped, asking logistical questions about belongings she had left behind or appointments I was supposed to remind her about, but there was no warmth, no hint of reconciliation. It was as if the accusation had not only severed trust, but erased years of shared history, reducing our relationship to little more than an administrative exchange. I began to realize that Elise was not just avoiding me. She was actively constructing a new narrative in which I was the antagonist, the problem to be managed or dismissed. In the midst of this, I struggled with my own need for connection, and my growing understanding that sometimes love is not enough to bridge the gaps forged by resentment and fear. I found myself writing letters I never sent, pouring out memories of better times, apologies for mistakes I had never consciously made, and hopes for healing that felt increasingly distant. These letters became my secret companions, folded carefully and placed in the drawer of my nightstand, a testament to the woman I was before the fracture and the woman I still hope to be. At night I would read them by the soft glow of the bedside lamp, letting the words remind me that I was still whole, even if the pieces felt scattered. The community around me, once a source of quiet support, began to reflect the changing tides of my personal life. Invitations to church gatherings and neighborhood teas became less frequent, and when they came, I sensed a hesitation, an unspoken question about which side I was on or whether I was even welcome. The gentle gossip that floats like dust motes in sunbeams carried whispers of scandal, of family discord, and I could not help but feel the sting of those unseen judgments. Yet, amidst this, there were moments of unexpected kindness, a shared glance from a passerby, a neighbor who left a freshly baked pie at my door without explanation, a volunteer at the library who lingered a little longer to ask about my health. These small acts, though few, reminded me that life continued beyond the confines of betrayal. During this period, I also began to notice changes within myself, subtle but profound shifts that marked the beginning of a new chapter. The embarrassment that had once kept me silent started to give way to a quiet, simmering defiance. I refused to let Elise's accusations define my identity or dictate the terms of my existence. I found solace in the familiar, in the mundane, and in the routines that anchored me when everything else felt adrift. I started to document my days in a small notebook, jotting down moments of gratitude, observations of the changing seasons, and reflections on the strength I was discovering within. This act of writing became a lifeline, a way to reclaim my voice and assert my presence in a world that seemed intent on erasing me. In the midst of this growing resilience, I made a decision to reach out, to seek counsel, to understand my rights, and to prepare myself for whatever lay ahead. I contacted a local attorney, a woman known for her compassion and sharp mind, who listened without interruption as I recounted the events and the pain beneath them. Her calm presence and clear guidance gave me a measure of hope and a plan for moving forward. She helped me understand that the receipt I had found was not just a piece of paper, but a legal anchor, something that could protect me from further false accusations. We discussed the possibility of documenting the history of our relationship, gathering witnesses, and preparing for any future confrontations. This preparation was empowering, transforming fear into action. Despite the escalating distance and the quiet cruelty of exclusion, I refused to become a passive victim of my circumstances. I began to nurture relationships outside the family, reconnecting with old friends, and forming new bonds with women in my community who understood the complexities of family dynamics and the strength required to survive them. Together we shared stories over cups of tea, laughter that lifted the weight of loneliness, and moments of quiet solidarity that reminded me I was not alone in this struggle. These connections became a source of nourishment for my spirit, grounding me in the knowledge that dignity and love can exist even when family fails. As the weeks passed, I found strength in the routine of my days, the small joys of gardening, baking, and walking along the shore. The rosemary bush flourished under my care, a living symbol of resilience and renewal. The scones I baked carried the warmth of my hands and the hope of healing, their sweet scent weaving through the house like a gentle invitation to reclaim my space. I no longer waited for Elise's calls or visits, no longer measured my worth by her acceptance or rejection. Instead, I focused on building a life that honored the woman I was and the woman I was becoming. A life marked not by betrayal, but by quiet courage and the steady reclamation of my own story. In this slow unfolding process, I learned that healing is not a single event but a series of small steps, each one a choice to rise above pain and claim one's place in the world. The accusation of theft had tried to rewrite my narrative, to cast me as a villain in a story that was never mine to tell. But by holding on to the truth, by nurturing my dignity and seeking connection beyond the narrow confines of family, I began to chart a new course, one defined not by loss, but by the quiet strength of a woman who refuses to be erased. The days of silence and isolation were not the end, but the beginning, the first escalation in a journey toward reclamation and peace that I was only just beginning to understand. The moment I found the receipt tucked away inside the novel in Elise's purse was not just a discovery of proof, but a turning point in the long and quiet battle I had been fighting against the weight of accusation and betrayal. Holding that small slip of paper between my fingers, its edges crisp and its ink still sharp, I felt a surge of clarity that swept away the fog of doubt and exhaustion that had settled over me in recent weeks. It was as if the receipt was more than just a document. It was a symbol of my reclaimed voice, a beacon cutting through the shadows that had threatened to consume me. In that instant, I understood that the power to rewrite the narrative did not lie with those who sought to diminish me, but with myself. This realization stirred something deep within, an ember of resolve that began to kindle into a steady flame, warming the cold silence that had filled my days. I did not rush to confront Elise immediately. Instead, I spent hours sitting quietly in the living room, the receipt resting on the coffee table beside me, catching the afternoon light that filtered through the lace curtains. I thought about all the years of my life spent nurturing family ties, about the sacrifices made in the name of love and loyalty, and about the slow erosion of trust that had brought us to this painful moment. The realization that truth could be both fragile and resilient gave me a strange comfort, a sense that though the path ahead was uncertain and fraught with difficulty, I was not without tools to navigate it. I began to feel a subtle shift in my spirit, not the explosive anger or despair I had braced for, but a calm, measured strength that urged me forward with quiet confidence. The next morning, when the police officers returned to follow up on the investigation, I was prepared. I handed the receipt to the lead officer with steady hands, watching as his eyes scanned the familiar lines and numbers. Elise's reaction was immediate and telling, her face flushed with a mixture of surprise and something I can only describe as desperation masked by indignation. She attempted to dismiss the receipt as unrelated, a mere coincidence, but the officer listened carefully, his expression unreadable as he pocketed the evidence and requested she step outside for further questioning. In that moment, I felt a profound sense of relief, but also a sober understanding that the road to healing would be slow and uncertain. The accusation had cracked the foundation of our relationship, and even as truth began to surface, the emotional rubble remained. With the police momentarily occupied, I took a deep breath and allowed myself to sit with the conflicting emotions swirling within me: relief, sadness, hope, and exhaustion. The house felt lighter somehow, as if the act of presenting the receipt had lifted a veil that had obscured the truth for too long. Yet the space where Elise's presence had been felt both empty and charged with possibility. I realized that this moment was not just about clearing my name, but about reclaiming my identity from the shadows of suspicion and silence. It was the first real step toward breaking free from the cycle of passive acceptance and reclaiming agency over my own life. In the days that followed, I found myself reflecting deeply on the nature of resilience and forgiveness. I understood that while the receipt had given me tangible proof, it could not by itself heal the wounds inflicted by years of unspoken grievances and fractured communication. Healing, I came to see, required more than truth. It required courage, patience, and the willingness to confront pain without being consumed by it. I began to journal regularly, pouring my thoughts and fears onto paper as a way to process the complex emotions that ebbed and flowed through me. Writing became a balm, a means to articulate the unspoken and to trace the contours of a new beginning. The subtle shift within me began to ripple outward, influencing the way I navigated my days and interactions. I found myself setting small boundaries that had long been absent, learning to say no without guilt, and prioritizing my well-being in ways I had previously dismissed. This newfound clarity was not born of bitterness, but of self-respect, a recognition that my voice mattered and that my experiences deserved acknowledgement. I started reconnecting with friends and neighbors, sharing more openly about my journey and receiving their quiet support and understanding. These connections became lifelines, reminders that while family bonds had frayed, the broader community offered space for healing and belonging. Simultaneously, I sought legal counsel to understand my rights and to ensure that I was protected against further false accusations. Meeting with a compassionate attorney who specialized in elder law was empowering. Her clear explanations and practical advice helped demystify the legal processes that had seemed daunting and inaccessible. Together, we discussed strategies not just for defense but for reclaiming control over my affairs and estate, measures that symbolized a broader reclaiming of autonomy. This pragmatic approach grounded me, providing structure and purpose amid the emotional turbulence. Amid these changes, I continued to cultivate my daily rituals, tending my garden, baking, walking along the shoreline, activities that tethered me to a sense of normalcy and peace. The rosemary bush flourished under my care, its evergreen resilience mirroring the quiet strength growing within me. Baking scones and lemon cakes became acts of self-kindness, small affirmations that I was deserving of comfort and joy despite the fractures in my family. Each step forward, no matter how small, was a testament to the possibility of renewal. One afternoon, as I prepared tea for a few friends who had come by to visit, I felt a profound sense of grounding. Their presence, their laughter, and their simple acceptance of my story without judgment created a sanctuary within the walls of my home. It was a reminder that while the past could not be undone, the future remained unwritten, open to the possibilities I chose to embrace. I realized that this midpoint was not just a pause in my journey, but a pivot, a moment of conscious transition from silence and invisibility to voice and visibility. In this space of quiet transformation, I found a new understanding of love. Not the conditional, controlling love that had so often marked my relationship with Elise, but a love rooted in respect and freedom. I began to see that letting go of old patterns and expectations was not a loss, but a liberation, an opportunity to redefine what family and connection meant on my terms. This shift was subtle but profound, an internal realignment that opened the door to healing in ways I had not dared to imagine. The receipt, once a symbol of betrayal, had become a catalyst for growth. It was the key that unlocked a door to a room filled with light and possibility, a space where I could begin to rebuild not only my reputation, but my sense of self. The journey ahead would still be marked by challenges and heartache, but I faced it now with a renewed spirit, anchored in the knowledge that truth and dignity were within my grasp. This midpoint was the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter where I was no longer defined by what had been done to me, but by the strength with which I chose to rise. The weeks following the presentation of the receipt to the police were marked by a complex mixture of relief and an escalating tension that seemed to shadow every moment of my days. While the immediate threat of false accusation had been confronted and somewhat diffused, the emotional landscape between Elise and me remained fraught with unspoken hostilities and simmering resentments that no legal document could resolve. The atmosphere in my home felt charged, a quiet storm brewing beneath the surface, threatening to break with a force that neither of us could fully control. The subtle escalation that unfolded was not one of overt confrontation, but of a slow tightening of invisible threads, an intensifying pressure that tested the limits of my newfound resolve and the fragile peace I was striving to maintain. Elise's absence was palpable, not just in the physical sense, but in the way her presence lingered in the spaces she had once occupied, now hollowed out and charged with memories of conflict and loss. She ceased all attempts at communication save for terse, functional messages that conveyed only the barest necessities, devoid of warmth or reconciliation. Her refusal to engage in meaningful dialogue was a form of silent warfare, a deliberate withdrawal designed to assert control and inflict pain without the messiness of direct accusation. It was as if she sought to erase me from her life not by confrontation but by disappearance, a slow fading into a shadow that I could see but no longer touch. Each unanswered call and ignored message chipped away at my sense of connection and belonging, leaving behind a hollow ache that was difficult to articulate. Amid this growing silence, I became acutely aware of the subtle ways Elise's absence was felt in the fabric of daily life. Shared traditions were abandoned without ceremony. Birthdays passed without acknowledgement. Family gatherings were attended without my invitation or mention. The mutual exclusion was a painful dance of avoidance and denial, a reflection of the fractured bond that had once been the foundation of my world. I found myself navigating social occasions with a careful diplomacy, aware of whispered questions and sideways glances from acquaintances who had heard fragments of the story, but did not know how to offer support without overstepping boundaries. The community that had been my refuge now felt like a stage where my private pain was performed in hushed tones, a spectacle I neither sought nor wished to endure. During this time, I also faced the resurgence of painful memories and unresolved emotions that had been buried beneath years of caretaking and endurance. I recalled moments when Elise's criticisms had cut deeply, when her ambitions and frustrations had been projected onto me as if I were a canvas for her discontent. I remembered the loneliness of nights spent wondering if my efforts to be a good mother had ever been enough, and the sting of realizing that love, no matter how fiercely given, could be repaid with suspicion and distance. These reflections were both a burden and a balm, a reminder of the complexity of human relationships and the difficulty of disentangling love from hurt. I wrote extensively in my journal, using the pages to explore these tangled feelings and to chart a course toward acceptance and healing. The escalating tension manifested most palpably in the occasional encounters with Elise that punctuated the months following the accusation. These meetings were fraught with an awkwardness that neither of us could fully mask. A collision of history and estrangement played out in carefully chosen words and guarded gestures. On one such occasion, she arrived unexpectedly at my door, her expression unreadable, her eyes avoiding mine. We spoke in clipped sentences, our conversations circling around trivial matters as if we were strangers rather than mother and daughter. There was an unspoken agreement to avoid the heart of the matter, to preserve a fragile civility that could shatter with the slightest misstep. As she left, the silence between us stretched longer than any words spoken, a reminder of the gulf that now separated our lives. Compounding the emotional strain was the involvement of other family members, who, drawn into the conflict by loyalty or obligation, added layers of complexity to an already tangled situation. My grandchildren, caught between parents and grandmother, navigated their own feelings of confusion and loss with a quiet grace that both heartened and pained me. Their occasional visits were tentative and brief, moments of warmth tinged with the awareness of unspoken tensions. My son Adam oscillated between attempts at mediation and moments of cold distance, his efforts hindered by the weight of family history and his own struggles to balance competing allegiances. These dynamics underscored the ripple effects of the accusation, reminding me that the fracture extended far beyond the immediate parties involved. In the midst of this second escalation, I found unexpected solace in the support of friends and community members who offered quiet acts of kindness and understanding. Their presence was a balm to my weary spirit, a reminder that connection and compassion still existed beyond the fractured ties of blood. I began attending a local women's group, finding comfort in shared stories and the knowledge that I was not alone in navigating the challenges of family estrangement and betrayal. These gatherings provided a space for reflection and renewal, a place where I could reclaim parts of myself that had been obscured by pain. Through these connections, I rediscovered a sense of belonging and purpose that strengthened my resolve to move forward. Simultaneously, I continued to engage with legal counsel to safeguard my rights and to explore avenues for protecting my interests and well-being. The process was both empowering and daunting, a reminder of the practical realities that accompany emotional conflicts. I worked with my attorney to update my will and establish clear boundaries regarding communication and access, measures that symbolized a broader assertion of autonomy. These actions were not taken lightly, but with a measured understanding that self-preservation was necessary in the face of ongoing uncertainty. The knowledge that I had taken concrete steps to protect myself provided a foundation of security amid the emotional turbulence. Throughout this period, I maintained the rituals that had become anchors in my daily life, tending my garden, baking for friends, walking along the shoreline. These acts of care were not mere distractions, but deliberate affirmations of life and continuity. The rosemary bush flourished, its resilience mirroring my own, and the scent of freshly baked scones filled the house with warmth and possibility. I found comfort in the steady rhythm of the seasons, the turning of the tides, and the quiet constancy of the natural world. These moments of peace were vital, sustaining me through the darkest hours and reminding me that healing was a journey, not a destination. As the tension continued to build, I recognized the importance of setting firm emotional boundaries, protecting myself from the cycles of blame and recrimination that threatened to consume me. I learned to disengage from provocations and to respond to conflict with calm deliberation rather than reaction. This shift was neither easy nor instantaneous, but it marked a significant step toward reclaiming my peace of mind. I began to prioritize self-care in ways that felt radical, allowing myself rest without guilt, seeking companionship without obligation, and embracing solitude without loneliness. These choices reflected a growing awareness that my well-being was a responsibility I owed not only to myself, but to those who still cared for me. The second escalation was, in many ways, a test of endurance and clarity. It challenged me to navigate the complexities of family dynamics while preserving my own integrity and sense of self. The accumulation of distance, silence, and fractured interactions demanded a level of resilience that I did not always feel equipped to muster. Yet I found strength in the knowledge that I was no longer alone. The support of friends, the guidance of legal counsel, and the quiet power of daily rituals became the pillars upon which I leaned. Through these supports, I began to envision a future not defined by past wounds, but by the possibilities of renewal and reconciliation on my terms. Ultimately, the second escalation revealed the depth of the challenges ahead, while also illuminating the pathways to healing. It underscored the necessity of patience, courage, and self-compassion in the face of ongoing conflict. It was a period marked by pain and struggle, but also by growth and transformation, a testament to the enduring capacity of the human spirit to endure betrayal, reclaim dignity, and forge a new path forward. As I stood at this crossroads, I understood that the journey was far from over, but I faced it with a quiet confidence born of hard-won wisdom and an unyielding commitment to myself. The moment I decided to take the final irrevocable step toward reclaiming my life was not marked by a dramatic confrontation or a burst of anger, but rather by a quiet, resolute clarity that settled deep within me. The accumulation of weeks and months of tension, heartbreak, and subtle betrayals had culminated in a moment where the only viable path forward was to draw a line, one that would protect my dignity, my peace, and my autonomy. The act of writing that letter to my lawyer was both symbolic and practical, a deliberate severing of ties that no longer served my well-being. It was an act of sovereignty, a declaration that I was no longer willing to be subjected to manipulation or to live under the shadow of false accusations and fractured family bonds. I sat at my kitchen table, the same worn oak that had borne witness to countless family meals and shared stories, and carefully composed the letter with a steady hand. My words were measured but firm, conveying a clear message that any further attempts to control or harass me would be met with legal resistance. I outlined that I was of sound mind and living in a safe environment, making it unequivocally clear that I was acting of my own volition. The letter was addressed to the attorney representing Elise and Adam, a formal and unyielding boundary that transformed months of emotional turmoil into a concrete assertion of my rights. As I sealed the envelope, a sense of finality washed over me, not bitterness, but a profound relief that the time for silence and endurance was over. At the same time, I penned a brief but heartfelt letter to Elise, not as an act of reconciliation, but as a statement of my truth and my decision to move forward independently. I acknowledged the pain that had passed between us without assigning blame or seeking to reopen wounds. My words expressed neither anger nor forgiveness, but a mature acceptance that some relationships cannot be mended, only honored for what they once were and respectfully set aside. I sent that letter with the same deliberate calm, aware that it marked a turning point in both our lives, a goodbye of sorts, though not necessarily final, but necessary for my own healing. The days following the dispatch of these letters were filled with a curious mixture of silence and anticipation. I did not expect immediate responses. Instead, I found myself preparing for whatever consequences might arise from my assertion of independence. True to form, the family's response was measured, marked by a series of tentative calls and messages from Elise and Adam, each tinged with a mixture of regret, frustration, and pleas for dialogue. I chose not to engage immediately, honoring the space I had created for myself and the boundaries I had set. This restraint was itself an act of power, a refusal to be drawn back into cycles of accusation and control that had defined our interactions for too long. Within this space of self-imposed distance, I turned my attention to nurturing new relationships and reinforcing the connections that sustained me. Friends who had stood quietly by offered their support in practical and emotional ways, sharing meals, offering companionship, and listening without judgment. I found particular solace in my bond with a small circle of women in the community who understood the complexities of family estrangement and the courage required to break free from toxic patterns. Together, we shared stories, laughter, and tears, creating a network of mutual empowerment that bolstered my resolve and enriched my days. The act of reclaiming my power extended beyond correspondence and social connections. I began to assert control over my living space and my daily routines with renewed vigor. I arranged my home not as a stage for past dramas, but as a sanctuary for present peace and future possibilities. I planted new flowers in the garden, their blooms a testament to resilience and growth. I took pleasure in small, deliberate acts of self-care, preparing nourishing meals, engaging in gentle exercise, and carving out time for reflection and creativity. These acts were not mere distractions, but essential components of my healing, reinforcing the message that I was worthy of care and respect. One afternoon, as I prepared to attend a gathering at the local community center, a knock at the door interrupted my preparations. Standing on the threshold was Elise, her expression hesitant, her posture uncertain. The sight of her brought a rush of memories and emotions, but I met her gaze with steady calm, prepared for whatever this encounter might bring. She asked if we could talk privately, and I nodded, leading her to the sitting room where we had shared many conversations over the years. The room, bathed in soft afternoon light, seemed a fitting place for this pivotal moment, a space where past grievances could be acknowledged and new understandings might begin to take root. Our conversation was tentative, punctuated by pauses that spoke volumes in their silence. Elise expressed regret for the pain she had caused, and confusion about how our relationship had come to this point. I listened without interruption, allowing her the space to speak her truth, even as I maintained the boundaries I had established. I shared my own reflections, emphasizing the importance of respect, honesty, and mutual care in any relationship. We did not resolve our differences that day, nor did we attempt to gloss over the wounds, but there was a palpable shift, a mutual recognition of the need for space and time, and perhaps a faint glimmer of hope for future reconciliation on healthier terms. Following that meeting, I felt a lightness I had not known for months, as if a burden had been lifted by the simple act of honest communication. I understood that healing is rarely linear or complete in a single moment. It is a process marked by steps forward and backward, by patience and perseverance. The clarity I gained from this encounter reinforced my commitment to prioritize my well-being and to approach the future with both caution and openness. In the weeks that followed, I continued to receive messages from Elise and Adam, some apologetic, others tentative, and a few tinged with frustration. But I maintained my boundaries, responding only when I felt it necessary, and always with measured calm. This balance allowed me to engage on my own terms, preserving my peace while leaving the door open for whatever form our relationship might take in the future. It was a delicate dance, one that required vigilance and self-compassion, but it was one I was determined to master. The culmination of this journey was not a dramatic reconciliation or a triumphant victory, but a quiet reclaiming of self, a declaration that my life belonged to me, shaped not by the judgments or betrayals of others, but by my own choices and values. It was the moment I realized that freedom is not merely the absence of conflict, but the presence of dignity, respect, and the courage to stand alone when necessary. As I folded the last letter into its envelope and placed it in the mailbox, I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me, a gentle assurance that I had finally taken my rightful place in my own story. The days after sending those letters marked a new chapter in my life, one not defined by the shadows of betrayal or the weight of false accusations, but by a calm I had long sought but rarely found. The quiet that settled over my home was not empty or lonely. Rather, it was filled with a gentle sense of liberation, as if the air itself had shifted and allowed me to breathe more deeply, more freely than I had in years. I continued my routines with renewed intention, each small act a step toward reclaiming not just my home, but my sense of self and purpose. The garden flourished beneath my care, the rosemary bush standing tall and fragrant by the window, a living symbol of resilience and hope. I baked scones and lemon cakes to share with the women's circle at church, their sweet scent weaving through the rooms like a quiet celebration of survival and renewal. Though the distance between Elise and me remained, I no longer felt the aching need to bridge the chasm on her terms. Instead, I focused on cultivating the relationships that nurtured me, friends who offered companionship without judgment, neighbors who shared quiet moments of kindness, and the women's group where stories were exchanged with empathy and strength. These connections reminded me that family is not solely defined by blood, but by the bonds we choose to honor and nurture. I wrote letters to my granddaughter, choosing honesty tempered with compassion, hoping to pass on the truth of my journey without bitterness, so she might understand the complexities of love and the necessity of self-respect. The legal steps I took to update my will and protect my interests were acts of clarity and peace rather than vengeance. I wanted my legacy to be one of dignity and truth, free from the entanglements of pain and mistrust. Meeting with my attorney was empowering, a practical assertion that I had control over my life and my story. Each signature on the documents was a reaffirmation that my voice mattered, that my choices deserved respect, and that I was capable of shaping my future even when the past had been fraught with hardship. There were moments of quiet reflection when I allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had passed. The loss of closeness with a daughter I once held dear, the sting of accusations, and the slow unraveling of what had once seemed unbreakable. These moments were not filled with bitterness, but with a gentle mourning, a recognition that some chapters close not because of anger but because the story has run its course. I came to understand that healing does not mean forgetting or excusing, but finding peace within the truth of our experiences and choosing how to move forward with grace. One afternoon, as I sat by the window watching the waves roll gently onto the shore, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the strength that had carried me through, for the kindness that had sustained me, and for the possibility of a future defined, not by pain but by hope. The tea I sipped was warm, the rosemary scent mingling with the salt air, and in that moment, I felt fully present, anchored in a life reclaimed and a story rewritten with courage and dignity. I knew that the path ahead would hold its challenges, but I was ready to meet them with the quiet strength that had brought me this far. To any woman who finds herself silenced, accused, or diminished by those she once trusted, I offer this: your voice matters. Your truth is your power. In the face of betrayal, you can find resilience. In the silence, you can find your song. And in choosing yourself, you can rediscover a peace that no one else can take away. Life may not always grant us the justice we seek, but it offers us the chance to reclaim our dignity and to live with the quiet courage of a heart that has known pain and still chooses to beat with hope.